Hey there people, welcome to part 4 of every single plugin in Logic explained. In this video we'll be covering some of the specialized plugins that they have to offer, the metering plugins, the MIDI effects, and more. If you haven't seen the first 3 parts, I'll link to those in the description, but this will be the last and final part to fill out every single plugin in Logic. And with that being said, let's get into it. But that will lead us out of the modulation category of plugins and lead us right into the next category of plugins, which I forgot, but it is multi-effects. Multi-effects refers to the plugins in Logic that do multiple things at once. Let's put all these vocals together and let's use some multi-effects to process them and make them sound a little bit better. Logic, multi-effects, we'll go into Beat Breaker. Beat Breaker actually works best on the stereo output because we're going to be dealing with breaking the whole beat itself. This can be really cool for remixes and things like that, but let me show you what it does. I don't often use it, but it's got some cool features. So what we can do is we can make this halftime, instant triplet. You can see all these patterns at the bottom here. They have some really cool things that you can do. We can also adjust each of one of these individually to get some different effects. As you can see here, in this category, we're messing around with the timing of the beat. Really cool with the repeats there, get some cool effects. And then volume can be similar to kind of what we did with that tremolo, get some stutter effects like we talked about. You can mess around with the input beat, the speed of each one on this timing. You can mess around with the repeats here. And then, of course, the volume. You can also adjust the slope of it so that it slopes in. And then if you end up actually breaking your beat like I just did, you can go here, you can go recall default, and everything will be back to normal. Super cool effect and really easy to get some interesting sounding stuff with Beat Breaker. I don't use it all super often, but the possibilities that you can use for some unique sounding beats, especially if you're a DJ, I could see this being extremely, extremely helpful. Let's go into multi-effects. We'll go into the next one, and it is Phat FX. Now, this is one I use quite frequently. Phat FX is a multi-effects plugin that has a ton of options available in it, including filters, including a bandpass filter, some normal filters, distortion, some modulation effects, some bass enhancer, compressor, some envelopes, some LFOs, and even a master limiter, which includes some soft clipping, which I think sounds good. Now, the default will have all of these turned on, and I really usually only use this for 2 things. I use this for distortion or bass enhancer. Let me show you what bass enhancer might do on the stereo output. I usually like to tune this hertz to whatever key of the song is in. I'm not exactly sure what this one is in, but I'll just say around 93 hertz sounds good. Then I'll adjust this. And you can hear that that bass is getting enhanced. So that's something I'll use on the low end itself, maybe the kick, maybe the bass, and I really like using that. The compressor, the filters, bandpass, those are all things we've talked about before. Same with the LFOs. You can use them for anything that you want to in this, but this is the main thing I use it for. The bass enhancer and then distortion. Occasionally, the last thing I'll use this for is this master outbus, which has a limiter, which you can do hard clipping, which can sound good to get some more volume in the mastering stage, or even soft limiting. I know I talked about limiters a little bit before, but that's what I would use this for, and I actually do use this multi-effects, this Phat FX quite often. Let's go into the next one for multi-effects, which would be remix effects. For the remix effects, I see this being extremely helpful for DJs or somebody that are trying to remix a song. I put this on the stereo output once again, and you'll see some of the effects it does. As you can see, we have a cutoff, resonance, XY over here, and a rate and a mix for a repeater over here. Let me just quickly show you what this does. The best way is just to see it and hear it in action. As I click and drag my mouse around, the filter and the resonance is being affected. You can also chop the beat up a little bit by going here. This is less chopped, this is more chopped. You can also add some bit crush here. And you can also use this repeater. Add the mix up, go up here, and then let go. All into the BPM of the song. It's super easy and super cool. You can also add some more options up here where you can use this. You can use the Phat FX or the classic filter. You can use the note repeater time, etc., etc. You can change a few of the options here. The default is pretty good though, and that's probably what I'd recommend if you're just getting started. The next one is called Step Effect. This is going to look kind of like a combination of a step sequencer mixed with that Phat FX plugin that we had before. Just like before, we have some of the same things we can affect. In this case, we're going to turn on this filter, and this filter is going to go through this step sequencer, or in other words, as we go through the song, it's going to get louder, then softer, louder, softer, louder, softer, as we go, and we're going to be affecting the parameters as such. As this goes through the step sequencer, the cutoff is getting affected in different ways. And we could use this in so many different ways to get some cool effects. Now let's say we don't want that filter. We can turn on different things to actually modulate them in different ways. We can turn on this distortion, we have an exciter or even dirt, adjusting this as we need be. But what I would recommend if you're getting started is, once again, going into these presets, going into some of these and just seeing what they sound like. We'll go into some simple gated and let's just, I don't know, rhythmic reverse. Let's hear what this sounds like. Kind of a cool effect. Let's see if we can find something else. Let's try subtle pan rhythm. Really crazy effect there. I could see this being used on some individual instruments to get some really cool results and just experiment with it. Let's go on to pitch. I use pitch a ton in Logic, and if you are a singer, a vocalist, then you probably will too. Okay, we are in the key of B flat according to just playing this, and that is an important thing. If you are looking how to find the key of your beat and how I just did that, check out this video I made right up here. It will show you exactly how I go about doing it. Once I have the correct scale selected, in this case B flat major, I can adjust the response and tolerance and detune as I see fit to get more of an auto-tune effect. This pitch correction plugin is an auto-tune effect. As I adjust this response time, the tolerance and detune, once I have my scale picked out, then I'm gonna get more of a T-Pain style auto-tune effect. If I adjust the response time and put it lower or higher, I'm gonna get more of a natural sounding effect. Check this out.
What she don't know, she don't know. What she don't know, she don't know. No, she don't know. What she don't know.
As I turn this tolerance down, the algorithm will work even harder. Can turn this tolerance up and get more of a natural sound. And also turn this response up and get more of a natural sound. The pitch correction is a great plugin, and Logic has recently updated it so that it works a bit better than it did before. It also has got a new skin GUI upgrade, which is always helpful. This is auto-tune, especially in Logic. If you are a singer, I highly encourage you to mess around with this. Even if you don't think you need it, it can really help glue a song together and make it sound more professional because it'll be more in pitch. Moving along to the next part of the pitch plugin, which will be the pitch shifter. This is exactly what it says it's going to do. You can adjust the pitch of your voice or whatever instrument. I use it most frequently on vocals to semitones away from your original vocal. You can also fine tune it with cents. Cents are 1/100th of a semitone, and semitones are just the next note. If you went from C to C sharp, that'd be one semitone. You can also adjust the mix knob as you see fit, just like normal. Check this out.
She don't know what she don't know.
She don't know what she don't know. She don't know. No, she don't know what she don't know.
She don't know what she don't know.
And then semitone sense will be more of a fine-tuned metric. Latency compensation can help if you find your vocal getting delayed a little bit. I often keep this on vocals for timing because this is what I'm using it for the most often. But if you're using something like speech or drums or something else, you can use those other settings as you see fit. 99% of the time I'm using this on vocals. And that is the basics of the pitch shifter. Let's move into the last pitch plugin, which would be the vocal transformer. This is my favorite pitch plugin that I use in Logic. The pitch correction plugin is probably the one I would use the most, but I do use Antares Auto-Tune because it sounds better than the Logic stock pitch correction plugin. But I actually use this stock plugin to change my format. When you sing and you look at the frequency spectrum, you see these big peaks and valleys right here. This is the bass note that we're singing on, and these are the upper harmonics. The format will shift these upper harmonics to either be higher or lower. That means that the bass note will stay the same, but the timbre or the tone of our voice will change as we change the timbre or the format of our voice. If we have a higher format, these harmonics will get slightly moved up. If we have a lower format, these will get slightly moved down. Check it out. I'll demonstrate it in real time here. You can see that that bass note's still there, but these are becoming more prominent. Oppositely, we're doing this. This bass note becomes more prominent, and these get shifted down a little bit. It sounds as if your mouth just suddenly becomes a lot bigger with a lower format. Oppositely, it sounds a lot smaller or kind of like Mickey Mouse if you increase the format. I don't like to adjust these format a ton, but I will go like plus or minus 5 to get kind of a robotic or kind of an alien type sound. Check it out.
She don't know what she don't know. She don't know what she don't know. She don't know.
Or plus 5.
She don't know what she don't know, she don't know what she
This
don't
could be
know.
really cool for some background vocal effects just to give them a cool sound. They also have this robotize knob, which can take your sound, put it directly on a pitch. I don't often use that. There's also a dry wet knob. I often use this at 100% wet, then just adjust the format accordingly. There's some other effects that you can change down here, including glide, grain size, and some fine pitch. I don't often touch these. Often what I'll do is I'll just load this up, I'll change the format, call it a day. Use some other processing to help out. But that's the basics of the vocal transformer. Hopefully you can go and use it yourself. Moving on to the next category of plugins in Logic. We're just flying right on by here, and we're done with pitch, and now we're on reverb. Logic has some really great stock reverbs, and they are easy to use, but I'm going to explain each one in detail and what one I like to use and why. Let's hop in to ChromaVerb, and we're actually going to use all three of these vocals, which I put into a bus to adjust the reverb as we see fit. We'll go in here, we'll go into Logic, reverb, and we'll start with ChromaVerb. Just like normal, my biggest recommendation if you're getting started with any of these plugins is to go into these presets up here and choose something that you like. In this case, reverbs are usually divided into different categories based off of the reverb that they're emulating. Rooms, for example, are emulating room sounds. Halls are emulating hall type sounds. Usually halls are bigger reverbs than room. In this case, we also have chambers. Chambers would think like kind of a big cathedral would be an example of a chamber. Chambers are the biggest out of all of these so far. And then ambiances would be the smallest, the shortest reverb time, but it will just give it some kind of atmosphere that will go along with it. Let's choose an ambiance for now. We'll go into ambiances. We'll choose medium ambiance, and we'll go from there. Now, some of the things to know about these knobs at the bottom is all of these will adjust the sound. The decay might be the most important part of your reverb sound. As you go higher and higher, the decay is how long it's going to be before your reverb signal actually decays or stops playing. So if we have 100 seconds, and we stop that, that's gonna go for 100 seconds. That's probably too much. But that's what's really cool about ChromaVerb. You can get some really long reverbs that you can't get with some of the other reverb plugins in Logic. The attack is exactly what it sounds like. How soon after are we going to actually enact this reverb? That's similar to pre-delay. Pre-delay is the amount of milliseconds after a sound starts that the reverb will enact itself. In this case, we have 8 milliseconds according to this preset, which means after our vocal goes, we have 8 milliseconds until the reverb will start kicking into place. You can also mess around with the distance. The farther back or the higher the distance number is, the farther away that reverb will be perceived. And similarly, if it's at 0%, it will be perceived as closer. But just like the delays, we are really worried about these two knobs, especially the dry and wet knobs. Dry signal being the original signal and wet signal being the reverb signal. If we go 100% wet, we can hear that reverb, which actually can be helpful for determining if this reverb sound is exactly what we want. Because we're exactly on the track here, we're going to put our dry at 100%, and then we'll mix our wet knob in to taste. Take that distance up, it sounds a bit close. Sounds a lot better. Now, there's also a dampening EQ on ChromaVerb that can be really helpful. As you can see, these are kind of the main frequencies. It looks pretty cool, but all this is saying, hey, these are where the frequencies are concentrated, and this is a dampening EQ to get rid of them. Just like adding an EQ after, we can get rid of some of these frequencies in the EQ itself, which can be helpful. So now we have a mid-dipped EQ. Now we have a high EQ, and so on and so forth. We can also change the type of reverb up here with ChromaVerb. Just like I was talking about before, we have the chamber, concert, theater, vocal hall, etc., etc. Each one's going to have slightly different characteristics, and you can experiment with these as you'd like to. I'd also really recommend just going through these presets. They're going to give you great starting points, and you don't have to think about the reverb too much as you go. Let's move on to the next type of reverb, which is not nearly as intuitive as the ChromaVerb. My two favorite reverbs are the ChromaVerb and Space Designer, but we'll get on to the OnVerb or the EnVerb. I don't use this plugin, straight up don't, but it is another reverb plugin that you can use. As you can see, we have a dry, wet knob, just like before. We have a high cut, and we also have a stereo spread, density, and that crossover frequency, as well as the low frequency level. Let's go into one of these presets. Let's see what it sounds like. A works. We have a lot of the same knobs just in different places. Like for example, we have a pre-delay, we have this attack, which is really well visualized, at least in this plugin. This is what's saying, hey, this reverb is going to come in like this. The decay, the sustain, the release, so on and so forth. This works more like a synth envelope than it does kind of the other reverbs we have, but it's a good visual way of kind of seeing this, especially like this. We also have the dry and wet knob, just like before. That would be to adjust those settings as I was talking about with the last reverb, but I just never use this plugin ever. I prefer the other reverb plugins. Next up, we have SilverVerb. This is one that I use more often than the EnVerb, but one that I probably use the second least out of the 4. So just like before, let's choose a preset and let's see what happens. Let's just do a classic hall, put this dry up at 100. We have a high cut, we have a low cut, so we can kind of band pass this in the middle. We have that room size similar to before, that reflectivity, which is kind of indicative of the room size and the types of walls in the room. The density and time, we have the pre-delay like before, and we also have some modulation that we can add into it, just like with some of our other modulation plugins that we talked about before, to make it evolve over time. But if you're going to use this plugin, strongly recommend choosing a preset, adjusting the dry wet knob, and calling it a day. Now, you don't need to spend too much time on these reverbs or get too intricate with it. I promise you, the main part that you need to get right is the song itself rather than nailing the reverb. There's a bunch of other parts that need to happen before you need to spend an hour twiddling with your reverb knobs. Let's go on to the last one, which may be my favorite in addition to ChromaVerb, which would be Space Designer. Space Designer is, in my opinion, the most well thought out of the reverbs. Also, one of the most realistic sounding reverbs that Logic has to offer. ChromaVerb to me sounds a bit more robotic. It sounds a bit more technological. Maybe futuristic is a good term. Maybe like synth type reverb. Space Designer is better at emulating realistic type room sound. So what we'll do here is if you look at all these presets, dang, we got a lot. We'll go into medium spaces, we'll go into halls, and we'll go into medium hall. We have a lot of presets. You can see that dry knob already at 100, just like we want. That wet knob's already here. The length and everything else is already kind of set into place. You can see the attack, the decay, just like what we had before. All of it is already good to go. All we have to do is just play our sound, adjust it as need be. Oh, we don't like medium hall, we can just go to the next one. Take that low spread down, get rid of some of that low end. This crossover is where this low spread and high spread actually starts enacting itself. So right now it's saying at 1K, this will be our low spread and below, and then our high spread will be above 1K, and that will be what we spread out there. So it makes sense for our low spread to be lower. Anything below 1K, generally we want our stereo spectrum to go out wide as we get higher and higher. If I'm going for a really long reverb time, I tend to use ChromaVerb. If I'm going for more of a realistic reverb, I will use Space Designer. That's kind of the way I look at things. I often use both of them if I'm using something, but I also like third-party reverb plugins as well. But the Logic stock plugins are pretty decent for what they are, especially being stock plugins. Moving on to some more specialized plugins, and in the category of specialized plugins, we have Exciter. Exciter is a really cool plugin, and I use it mostly on instruments that need some extra harmonic information up in the high end of the frequency spectrum. It's exactly what a exciter does. If we put an EQ after the exciter, we can kind of see what's going to be happening here. But what's going to happen is as I put up this harmonics, you'll see that these harmonics up here are going to be boosted a little bit. So we'll take these all the way up. You can hear these harmonics just getting boosted. And that's exactly what this exciter does. We can change the frequency we want this to happen at. So let's say like 460, boosted. 3500 boosted. You can hear that there. Let's turn it off. Before, after. Now obviously 200% harmonics is way too much. It's overkill, but it might work for your sound. I like to add in, 15%, 20% harmonics just to give some extra lift to my sounds. I'll use it the most often on vocals, but I'll also use it on acoustic guitars, electric guitars, synths, anything I think needs a little bit extra high end and boost in those upper harmonics to make the sound a little bit more filled out. I'll add it in. The key with exciters is subtlety. As with a lot of plugins, you're not going to be able to change the bass sound of your audio signal so much. You should really focus on getting that right first, and then use plugins like this to subtly enhance them. Let's go on to the next plugin of the specialized, which would be the SubBass. Now, the SubBass is specific to SubBass, perfect for adding in some low-end frequencies to any sort of bass notes that you might have. I'm actually going to add this to my bass channel and just mess around with it until I get something I like. So I'll bring it in so when the actual bass comes in and starts playing, we'll hear it. We'll also choose one of the preset. We'll go below the kick. Okay, this is the wet knob. So I just turned the wet knob up to 100% and the dry knob down, meaning the original signal is not going to come through, but this sub will come through. Now, as you can see, this frequency mix right here, this is 82 hertz and below, which is really, really low. Let's make this low end right here, maybe a little bit higher so you can hear it. But all this is doing is adding a sine wave down there, which can help boost up the sub itself, and etc., etc. I don't often use this particular sub bass. If I'm going to make a sub bass, I'll just use a synth and change the oscillator so that it fits the key of the song, rather than using something like this. But this can be helpful if you are trying to boost up your bass by adding a plugin rather than by adding a whole nother instrument. Go on to the next category of plugins, which is the utility plugin. Auto sampler being number one. Auto sampler is really great for saving and sampling your external MIDI devices. Now, this is not a full tutorial on auto sampler, and I'm not super familiar with it, but I do know in analog MIDI devices, some of them don't allow you to save preset patches, whereas you can save these into the sample note range that you can play them on the piano, import them into here, and then Logic will actually create recreations of them so that you can use them as software instrument. A super cool feature. I don't have any analog synth devices, so this doesn't really mean a whole lot to me, but if you do, I recommend watching somebody else's tutorial on it. I'm just not super familiar with it. If you don't have analog synths, which chances are you probably don't, then you don't need to worry about this one. Go moving right along, we have gain. And gain is a very, very important plugin for mixing, and let me explain why. I actually keep it on my mastering, my stereo out bus almost all the time for a couple of reasons. One, you can add gain, but my favorite thing to do with it is to use this mono compatibility just to see how my mix is sounding in mono. I find that if I mix my mix in mono and everything's balanced and you can hear everything, when I take that mono off and I go to stereo, it sounds that much wider, it sounds that much more professional, and so on and so forth. I also enjoy using the phase invert to check the phase of my mix. If I click left and my phase left is inverted, then check it out in mono, I'll phase invert left, right? Then I'll click it back. You can hear I'm actually losing some instruments completely, which means that my phase is the best as it is, which is exactly what you want. If you click one of these and then your phase isn't working, you'll notice it just like that. So that's what I use the gain plugin for the most. I also like to use the gain plugin so that on, let's say, an individual track like this, I made a whole video about gain staging, but this is just kind of one of the basics that I like to do is, look at, we're at minus 2.8, which is about right. My goal is with adding this gain plugin to get this fader back up towards unity so that I get more fidelity in my volume adjustment. Okay, let's use the I/O. I/O stands for input output. And yeah, basically all that this is doing is just kind of another gain plugin. You can adjust the input signal, you can adjust the output signal. This can be helpful for some instruments, but I never use this. I prefer to use the gain plugin. And the last one on the list, we have the test oscillator. The test oscillator is exactly what it sounds like. You're just going to be playing a certain wave, in this case, a sine wave. You can also play white noise, pink noise, square wave, needle pulse. Wow, exciting. So this can be really cool. We're also gonna turn this way, way down. What makes more sense for this is if you wanna do a sine sweep to test out your speakers or test out the room and kind of the acoustics, or you can change the frequency here. I don't use this test oscillator hardly at all. This test oscillator is really just to test out your system, see how it's working. How does it sound with the sine wave? How does white noise? How does pink noise sound? You can play this continuous type sound to just see how your plugins are affecting it, etc., etc. We'll turn this off though. We don't need this constant sound. That's totally fine. All right, there's a couple more meters that we need to go over. I'm not sure if I've already gone over these, but I'm going to redo them just in case I haven't. And the first one is going to be the loudness meter itself. The loudness meter is the loudness of the track in LUFS, or loudness units full scale. It's the most accurate and the most modern way of measuring loudness that we have, and it's also the thing that Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube Music all use to make your tracks normalize. In other words, they're going to read your track in LUFS, and anything above cutoff, usually the cutoff is -14 LUFS. Anything above that, it will turn down. Anything below that, we'll try to turn up so that everything is normalized across the entire library that it has. This is the thing I use the most. The M is more short term, the S is a longer term, and then I would be the integrated, which will happen once you click start. This will just be the bass itself. I usually put this as a mastering plugin on the stereo out. So if I go to my bass bus, then I can click here. I have one already loaded up. So you can see my momentary, my short term, we're even peaking like -12. My S, which is a little bit longer term, -15. That's pretty good, but usually for masters, especially for a pop track like this, my goal is to get it to -10, -9 LUFS so that it's dynamically competitive with the rest of the tracks. This is a measure of how compressed your signal is. If you've ever seen waveforms that just look really, really flat at the top, that's because they're really dynamically compressed and they're hitting a high LUFS. If you see waveforms that have a lot of peaks and valleys, chances are the LUFS is a lot more dynamic, or in other words, it's a lot higher, or I guess it would be lower. So it'd be like -18 instead of -9. Let's move on to the next metering plugin that we have, which would be the MultiMeter. The MultiMeter is a way of looking at your song in a ton of different ways. It's got a couple different meters. In this case, the first way is by looking at the actual frequency spectrum, which can be really helpful. You can see here, normally your frequency spectrum is going to peak somewhere in the low end. The low end has the most amount of energy. And then normally it will kind of go down at a rightward slope down here, kind of like this is going here. What I'm seeing though is at this 4K mark, this looks a little bit loud, which if you're listening to the mix, the snare does sound a bit loud. If I was to actually mix this, it'd probably be better if I take that down. You can also see this in LUFS, which is nice. You can see the left and right channels and see how they are different from each other, which is great. You can see that correlation meter like I was talking about before, which means we are mostly in phase. And then we can also adjust some different things and go from there. We can see our left channel, our left right max, our mono. We can change it from peak to RMS, which is root mean square fast or root mean square slow. I mostly leave it at peak though. And then finally in metering, the last one we'll use is a tuner. Now this can be helpful for tuning instruments. If I was going to play the guitar like I did on this track, first thing I would do is just make sure it's in tune. I'd make sure that each of those notes comes in exactly where I want it to go. And here's kind of a pro tip. If your guitar isn't correctly intonated, meaning that if you play all of your strings open and then you play your 12th fret pressed down and they're not exactly the same when it comes to the tuner, that means that it's going to be more beneficial for you to actually tune each individual note to what it should be on your guitar. This is a trick that I use sometimes if I'm dealing with an out of tune guitar. This can be helpful. Instead of tuning to E, A, D, G, B, E, like the normal open strings of a guitar, I'll tune to, let's say I know I'm going to be playing the 5th fret of the D string, so I'm going to play the 5th fret of the D string and play that note as a G and tune it to G because that's what it should be. Hopefully that makes sense. That's my pro tip to you. I also like to use this and throw this on if I'm playing the violin because of the violin can be a very volatile pitch instrument. I just want to know if I'm hitting that, how close I am. I'm not very good at the violin, so that's probably why. I do use my ears as well, but having that visual aid of the tuner helped me actually tune the violin and then determine if my actual bowstring is playing the right note and my fingers on the right spot can be helpful as well. Okay, and that is every single plugin of Logic. But wait, there are some more plugins that I'd like to cover in this video that I think you might find helpful. These plugins are the MIDI effects. MIDI effects are a really, really cool way to add variation, style, and things to your MIDI tracks that you might not otherwise be able to do. So let's open this MIDI track and let's get into some MIDI effects. You can see this MIDI effects part right above here, right above the instrument slot here. And we have all of these to go from. And what's cool about the latest update is you can actually stack these as you see fit. You used to only be able to do one, but now you can stack them however much you want, which gives you endless possibilities when it comes to music creation. The first one will be Arpeggio. And actually, I'm going to duplicate this track just so we can get kind of a pad sound. I'm going to go to keyboards and just choose one. I want something a little bit longer. Let's just go into a piano. Cool. So let's add in some MIDI effects to this just to see what happens. Arpeggiator is exactly how it sounds. It's going to take all of the chords that you played in this MIDI and it's going to put them on an arpeggio. So check this out. All you have to do is play some chords, adjust the rate, and there you go. You can make this even really fast. Exactly, and exactly. You can change how fast they go. You can change the pattern. You can change, this is only going from down to up. This is going from up to down. Meeting in the middle, completely random. and also a hand here. You can change the octave range over here if you want it to go over multiple octaves. You can also change the variation so that it changes up mid-pattern so that you don't have to as well. You can get into some more options here in terms of velocity. You can get into some more options here of what you actually will let it play on the keyboard. And then you can also adjust some more of the MIDI controller patterns. Arpeggio is a really cool thing, and I use it oftentimes for really, really fast arpeggios. Like, I definitely wouldn't be able to play that as clean as it's played right there. So if I was going for something that's really fast like that, I would just mess around with the arpeggio till I actually got something I like. Let's go into the next one, which would be chord trigger. Chord trigger is exactly how it sounds. Each of these notes, if you play them, are going to trigger an individual chord. It's not going to sound good because right now we have individual things being played. But let's say we take this bass line and we move it down here. This has individual notes. If we play this, now each of these is going to trigger its own chord. Cool. We can also adjust these individual chords. So like if we want to play this. So this could be a cool way to get some chords if you don't know how to play any chords in Logic. I don't often use this. I know exactly what chords I want, but if you're a beginner, this can be a cool way to find some unique chords. Let's get rid of chord trigger and go on to the next one. The next one would be Modifier. Modifier is exactly what it sounds like. What you can do is you can adjust the MIDI settings on your keyboard like a mod wheel and assign them to velocity. In this case, you can scale it to 200%. So anytime you would push the mod wheel up, you would increase the velocity by 200%, or down, be decreased by 200%. A super cool thing to add if you have some extra things like mod wheels. I personally don't. I do have some other things, some MIDI stuff, but honestly, I prefer using a digital keyboard and then programming in this MIDI data by clicking into here, clicking A, and then going in like this. This is just how I do my workflow. Obviously, a pitch wheel would be more convenient, but I just don't have one and it's not easily accessible for me, and that's just how I work. So let's go. Next up, we have the modulator. The modulator is just like it sounds. We've been talking about modulation quite a bit. Now, hopefully you understand it a bit better. But look, we have an LFO. We can change it up as we see fit. But what's cool, this isn't changing the original sound, this is changing the MIDI note. So what we can do is we can have this change different parts about the MIDI note. Let's try ramp down modulation to hear what I mean. You can see every time it hits, it's ramping down. I don't use this so often. You can change the type of LFO here. This is not something I use super often, but it can be cool. Note repeater up next. Just like with some of the other plugins we talked about, we're going to go into these MIDI notes and just repeat them. We're saying at an 1/8 note delay and go from there. We have the velocity ramp. We can turn it down. A cool way to get some MIDI delay rather than actually adding delay. Going into the next one, let's go to Randomizer. Cool. So what's happening here is every single note that's being played right now is going through this randomizer and completely being randomized what the velocity is. This can give some more human-like characteristics if you like that. You can also change this to velocity to tuning. If we change it to tuning, we're going to get some really weird sounding and out-of-tune things. But that could be exactly what you're looking for. And probably the most one you'd use this for is velocity. And you can also change this to have a high or a low. So this is saying that, okay, we're going to have our randomness only be in the middle 61%, but this can give it some more human quality. I did play this on my piano, so it already has a pretty human quality. You can see this by the different colors of MIDI notes, but this can be a really cool way if you just decided to pen in all of your MIDI notes and give them some more humanality, if you will. Moving right along to the Scriptor. Feeling like coding at all? You can actually code in Logic Pro, and you can use them to use and affect your MIDI notes. Have I used this? Not a single time. Would I use this? Absolutely, if I knew how, and maybe that's another video. Maybe I'll learn how to do this. I'll find something that's super cool, and I'll show you how to do it. If you're interested, let me know in the comments below. Let's do it. Next up, we have the Transposer, which is exactly how it sounds. Instead of manually shifting each of these notes, we can just go to the Transposer, take them down some semitones. Perfect. Another really helpful thing about the Transposer. Let's say we don't really know a bunch about music theory. We know that we are in the key of C. We can change this scale to major, and then we can make sure that everything we play is in C major. So now every note that's not in C major has automatically been transposed. It's not to say that it will sound good with these chords, but that can be really cool. In this case, R was in B flat. So if we do this, cool. We can also transpose this as we see fit and so on. This can be a really helpful way to just play a bunch of random notes on your keyboard, find the scale that you want to use, and go from there, bada bang. There you go. And the last one will be Velocity Processor. Now, this is one of my favorites to use, along with the Arpeggiator. If I had to choose two, those would probably be the two I use the most. But this one works as you'd expect a compressor to work, but instead of actually compressing your sound, it compresses your MIDI notes instead. So this usually gives a better result than a compressor. Instead of having all of these variations in MIDI notes, we can tell it anytime that a MIDI note goes above a certain threshold velocity. In this case, we're going to turn it down like a compressor would. You can see all these are falling here, and now they're much more closer together in volume than they would have been otherwise. And we can change the ratio as we see fit. It's very visual, which I really like. And we can also expand these to do the opposite. I'll usually do this very subtly because I like the humanality and the dynamic aspect of human playing. But I find if I really need to compress my MIDI sound, starting with this and then adding compression can give me even better results, more natural sounding results than I would have had otherwise. And as I said before, you can stack any of these as you want together to get some crazy just effects. This MIDI stacking happened in the newest update, so if you don't have Logic 11, then go and update it and you can do this feature as well. All right, people, that will do it for all of the effects, including the MIDI effects and every single plugin that you can find in Logic Pro. And that will complete part 4 of going over every single plugin in Logic. If you want to watch parts 1 through 3, go check them out in the link below. I also have down there a video that's going to have all of the parts. If you want to watch it in one super take, you can do that too. Happy music making, and I'll see you in the next one.